I'm procrastinating outside. They've turned on the humidity. We had a really nice long spring here in Hot Springs. It sort of warmed up and then it backed off and it was pretty gentle, and now we're back up into the 90s with 70% humidity. So, but the plants that like the heat are really happy, and we've had a lot of rain. So, but I need to go. I had lots of company this spring, so I kind of got behind on my garden projects, and I'm digging out more grass to plant okra and cucumbers. And I have a very cute little bunny that lives in the back corner. And he seems pretty well behaved. He was eating my phlox, and I wasn't my creeping phlox, and I was not super happy about that, but it didn't seem like he was too greedy. And although my neighbor has a lot of clover in her yard, so I sort of feel like I'm like, go eat the neighbor's clover. It's free instead of my perennials that I paid for. But he seems pretty well behaved, and we kind of have an arrangement. But then there are these deer that come in the night, and they tromp all over my beds. That's how I know they're there. Because I've loosened all the soil, so the deer hoof prints are like this deep. And I think my deer have a bit of a habit. I had a lovely stand of Nicotiana flowering tobacco in the front that had come back from the roots, and I was super excited about it. And because I thought it might self-sow, but it self-sowed and it came back from the roots. So there was almost more than I needed. But then, and the deer were fine with it last year, but this year they were like, they picked up a nicotine habit. So they've sort of stripped off all the leaves of almost all of that. So I had to kind of give them a haircut, and we'll see if they rebound. And then the deer moved on to the poppies. So nicotine and opium, I guess, is, I've got some stoned out deer visiting in the night, but I rarely see them. Just I see their little pellets and their footprint. So, and there's part of me, I feel like it's one of these challenges of, do I get mad? Do I figure out like a taller fence? Or, oh, there goes the bunny. He's running. He's very cute. Or sprays or this or that. And I'm just like, I'm just accepting, like this garden is a complex system, and it's not, the deer are not eating everything to the ground. They're just eating some things. And so maybe this is a lesson to just appreciate the things that you have, which are quite abundant, all things considered, and focus less on the things that you don't have. And they're getting actually very, and like maybe just marvel at the technical skill. Like I have these amazing gladiolas, and I had an orange one that, they're tall spikes of flowers. They're maybe like 4 or 5 feet high. And the spike is, several feet, and then the flowers open from the bottom up. And literally the deer have gotten the hang of, they go up to the stalk, and I haven't staked them, so they're kind of wobbly, and they like nip off the buds as they open up on the gladiolas. So, I have to kind of appreciate their ingenuity there. So, but anyway, so getting to what I wanted to say today, this has been something I've been thinking about. Like, so my garden work procrastination is procrastinating for a writing project that I'm also procrastinating on. So there's like a double level layer of procrastination. And this writing project involves weirdly some stuff around the movie Project Hail Mary. And you might have seen that I have a clip on my channel from there. But as I was putting together this writing project, which is sort of in a draft phase and preliminary, I was trying to think of a way to talk about like my process, because this in my LARP, it feels very processy, and how how you can be authentic to your process and who you are, while also being flexible and adjusting to circumstances as in time as things unfold and new relationships and new information emerges. And I'm not saying I can do it gracefully, but like how we could strive to do it gracefully or more gracefully, get some skills in that regard. And so one of the things, the images that came to mind that I wanted to put out there for people, because I always talk about like kind of having a Mary Poppins bag of lenses or tricks or ways of thinking about things that might come in handy if you get into a sticky situation or a challenging situation. You want to try on some different perspectives, use some different tools. And again, I would have done things probably pretty differently had I had a more equipped Mary Poppins bag and more people to put stuff into it, but I didn't. So I'm making my own, and I'm offering some possible things for your Mary Poppins bags if you choose to incorporate them. And so this one is, and it's interesting because I was just looking at, I've ordered a couple books by, is it Douglas Hofstadter? I Am a Strange Loop, and there's one called Fluid Analogies. And I didn't realize that he ran sort of an early computer initiative at the University of Indiana in Bloomington that had to do with the idea of analogy and how the consciousness and the mind make sense of things and how we apply one thing to the next thing. And yeah, and I think somehow my training in art history and symbolism of like looking at something and go, oh, it mean like on the surface, on the one level, it means this, but if you go deeper, it could mean this. You could tell this story with it or that story with it. Like you could do a lot of different things. So that's, and also my maps sort of structure out different like components that are certain structures that then I can sort of move around and apply to other maps. And so it sort of, I get like mental structures that are almost a language. I think I've talked about them in the past, is I feel like my maps are sort of my own language. And it was only later that I realized like phenomenological category theory could be a thing, and that seems to be my language. So anyway, so here's something for the Mary Poppins bag to consider that I came up with while I was writing this. And I was thinking back, I used to like to try to like look for nice toys and for my kid when my kid was little. And like some nice wooden toys. I mean, I wasn't too pop, but you know, anyway, like I liked these German toys, like these little wooden toys. And Haba, I guess, Haba was like one of the companies that had these like different kind of blocks and specialty things. And there was this little set, and I can't remember now if it was 6 blocks or 9. It was probably 9. And it came, they were wooden blocks, but they came in a little plastic suitcase with a window, and they kind of snap shut to hold all the blocks. And it was a set of puzzle blocks. And with the 9 blocks, say, you could make 6 different images, right? Because each side of the cube had was a part of a different, one of 6 different scenes. And so if the blocks were jumbled up, first you had to sort of sort out and figure out which ones made a set of 9. And then when you had the set of 9, then you had to order them to make the picture. And, you know, I was thinking about how to, like my maps were essentially like making pictures, right? I had all these different pieces and I was laying them out and I was organizing them. And then I was telling stories about them. And the first stories that I did when I was in Little Sis, I didn't really have the Curious Observer tool. So, and I still was inhabiting the role of like save the universe from bad things, which I don't recommend because it never turns out well. But that was the me, and I still love the me I was then. I don't feel bad about it. That's what I had the tools to work with, and I was doing the best I could. And so I was putting things together in my world that, you know, I showed up and there were things that didn't make sense, and I started laying out puzzle pieces and putting them together into stories, right? Which is kind of like these cube blocks. And then I did that for, 8 or 10 years, and man, the story got crazy, right? And very intense. And it only ramped up even more after 2020. And I scared myself a lot with the puzzles that I was making. But this is the trick. So, and then someone would say, well, but they might be putting together their own puzzle pieces and making their own stories, right? And in my live action Animus roleplay musical, which I didn't have back then, that idea, like, God loves diversity, not just, superficial policy diversity, but like all the different things, like all the different things are going to happen. So anytime you try to be like, no, but I have it right, I have the right thing and you don't, like, or you're close, but you need to tweak it. And then we'll all be on the same page. And like, I did that for some time, and that's silly because ultimately in my perspective, the goal should be, why don't we, strive for a world where everybody can do their thing, like with the gifts they came in with, like authentically, and try not to bump into other people and hurt them. And then we should be able to respect other people's ways of being and like learn from them sometimes, because sometimes like, and maybe the thing we learn we don't actually do ourselves, but like we can appreciate like and celebrate that they can do things that way because they have that set of equipment, and that is really cool. So, but then, so I made the scary story, and then it was sort of like, well, how do you step back from the scary story once you made it? And the clip that I have from Project Hail Mary that I put up, part of it says, the thing is, like I think the interviewer asked Ryan Gosling, who was on as Ryland Grace, the character, the human astronaut who makes a space buddy alien, Rocky, which is close to my heart because I lived for many years just about 5 blocks from the Rocky Steps at the Philadelphia Art Museum. And so they asked him, like, well, what attracted you about this role? So it's a 2.5-hour movie. It's very popular. And with the exception of some flashbacks that do have other actors, almost all of it is just Ryan Gosling as Grace talking to a puppet friend, Rocky, he's a rock. He's like a kind of a spider scorpion rock, but he's done with puppetry, not CGI. And so it's how that relationship unfolds. And so it's, for a long movie, I mean, it's pretty dialogue heavy, right? And there's a to me, as an art historian, not a media historian, but like I'm applying that lens, there's a lot in there. And so what he answered when he was asked, about the role, agreeing to do the role, he said, well, one, getting to, go into space and make an alien best friend and save the world, like that's a pretty awesome storyline. Yes. And then he said, and I think he has kids. I don't know if I think they're youngish kids. And he's like, we're in a world that's pretty we're telling ourselves it's pretty dystopic. And it's like this movie was a chance to say otherwise, and that it's like maybe the future isn't to be feared, but it's to be figured out. And I think ultimately there's no one single way of figuring it out. There's many ways of figuring it out. But can we do that from a place of playfulness, right? Or, from the curious observer standpoint instead of from the place of fear?
I'm not an actual space genius, right? I'm not. I'm like your biologist.
For now.
Okay. Thank you. That's nice.
What was it that first caught your eye about Project Hail Mary?
You go to another galaxy, you make an alien best friend, and then you save the world. So that's like, as an experience, it's extraordinary.
What else is there?
Yes. But I think there was just a kind of radical notion on Andy's part to say maybe the future isn't something to fear, rather it's something just to be figured out. We've been, saturated in dystopian narratives that have permeated almost the culture to a point where they feel inevitable. And to have this extraordinarily entertaining story somehow not be escapist, but somehow really be a reminder of what we're capable of was very moving.
I have a friend who sent me the Gene Keys book, and I can't remember. You get 4 numbers, and they sort of, each pair contrasts each other. And there's sort of the, the shadow side of the version, and then if you can sort of alchemize it, and then the better side of the version. And I can't remember all 4, but I was looking back at my 2, and one was essentially the shadow sides were impatience and hunger, and that both of them came from a place of fear. And so if you can kind of learn to confront the fear, the upside versions are boundlessness and miraculous wormholes, which seems like a great thing to have right now. Like that seems like a really good opportunity. And so, yeah, like how do we alchemize fear into playful curiosity with people you care about, right? And so I love the movie. I'm going to talk more about it. I have my own marigold, Golden Mary with the Annunciation dove. We have a dove that flies around here, and I've called her Agnes after the wife of Oni Madden, the mobster who ran Hot Springs for many years. And Agnes was the postmaster's daughter, which is interdimensional communication in my book. And so there's a white dove that I think is, it's somebody's dove, but I call her Agnes, and she flies around and does interdimensional communication here. So, Agnes, Annunciation, the return to Soul, and Mary, right, which is the spaceship. The spaceship is Project Hail Mary because it's this long shot, because they're worried about the sun dimming. There's a creature that's dimming all of the stars, but in my lens, I'm thinking it's more about the inner light that we have, and from more of the Behemist, like the Jakob Burma, the inner light that we all have, and that our connection to the divine and wonder and awe, and how to reclaim that. And that's sort of what the movie's about. So back to the puzzle, right? So you've got these puzzle pieces. There's 6 possible stories on the cube versions, and you're arranging the picture, and say you don't know, but you like green. There's more green on this one, so you sort of arrange those, and then you put together the scary story. And I'm sort of imagining when I was a kid, often there would be toys that would be like, and I'm sure today too, still Disney themed, right? And so if you imagine like there's 6 scenes from a Disney movie, and then there's the setup, and then there's the really dramatic arc scary part, and then there's the happy ending, and then there's a couple scenes in between to build out the characters. And so imagine if you were doing that set of blocks, but you were doing it, say your kitchen table had a glass top, and one of the glass blocks fell under the table while you were doing it. You accidentally knocked it off, or the cat knocked it off, or whatever. Cat category theory. And you go down to pick it up, and you happen to look up at the bottom side of the puzzle. And maybe the bottom side is the happy ending version, right? And so as you're assembling something, from one perspective, it looks like one thing. But if it occurs to you that there might be another way of looking at it, you can get in another place and realize there's another option, right? And they coexist, right? They're inverses of each other. And so that's a six-sided cube, but imagine you have a tesseract, right? Or, the floor D cube. Or what if you have a whole E8, which I think E8 lattice, that's like the Ruliad maybe, or the Akashic, or the all, right? The all. And there's a geometric sort of harmonic light-based foundation source, and it's all like you're interacting with that as your puzzle pieces, and it can be many things, and they're all equally true. And so it's not like when to give up the story you built, which is the scary story, which is really hard, because I'm saying this from my standpoint, because I'm like, I put in a decade of work putting together all these puzzle pieces, and I made the story, and look at it, look. And yeah, because it's hard to walk away from that, because essentially you feel like you're rejecting yourself. You're rejecting the work you put in. If you walk away, that you're stupid, or you are misguided, or somebody tricked you, or there's a lot of negative feelings about walking away, even if the story you built is scary, because your identity is built into it. Like, I made that, right? How do you turn away from it? But I think it's really interesting to think about, what if there's another puzzle picture on the other side, and it's much better. And so when I was looking at a recent talk by Donald Hoffman on Michael Levin's channel, and part of his Platonic space presentations, he was talking about, Hoffman, multi-scale collective intelligence. And he comes at things from a more information theoretic and observer-centric angle. And he has all sorts of mathematical equations and things about observer windows, and the window that you're looking out of. And even though I've never gotten back to the Project Genie, Google Project Genie thing, is like, those are the observer windows. In the beginning, all the spheres and the lenses, and you can look through the different puzzle, the different worlds that you make. There are these lenses, there are these portals, and there are observers. They're the observer portals, that you make as an observer. And then what Hoffman has said is that agency is your ability to knowingly shift your observer window.
And it turns out then you can go from the notion of observer to a notion of an agent. You think about agency as, I'm looking at the world through this window right now, this observer window, but now I want to look at the world from over here, or like there. I can look at the world in different ways. So I need to be able to change which of these windows. I was showing you those observer windows. And how do you do that? Well, I can write down a Markov matrix that says, if I'm looking at this window, what's the probability that I'll look at this next window over here? So once again, I get a Markov matrix for how I change my observer windows. And I get the notion that an agent is a Markov chain on the trace logic, and then I get that a set of agents has its own trace logic. So this is recursive. I have the trace logic on observations. Agency is walking around those observations. All the ways that you can walk around and look at through the different windows has its own new trace logic. And then I can keep recursing. Agency builds even nested layers of agency, recursive trace logics.
And I think that's really cool, is to how do you, maybe you wouldn't even know if the cat didn't knock off one block, and you happen to notice that there was something else underneath, because you would have no occasion, unless that had happened to you before, to think it was possible, right? You just wouldn't even know it was possible. And then all of a sudden you have this revelation. It's like, oh, and you look up top, and then you look underneath, and you look down, and you're like, oh, it unlocks all of these possibilities, right? And maybe not all the possibilities are great. Like, maybe if you have an E8 shooting all sorts of, different story bits and projectors and things, it might be overwhelming until we learn how to work with it better. And sort of my new perspective on like crypto is it, I actually thought about it for a long time, is that maybe it's a language. And I think in some way that there's going to be this intersection of digital currencies and community currencies with higher level math and culture and ritual and art, and that it's going to be a way of conversing with higher dimensional intelligences and the, not as aliens, really, although it could be alien. It's like Rocky is an alien. It's an alien intelligence, but then you get to know each other and how to communicate, and it's not really so alien anymore. But the idea of going back to the mystery schools, right? I mean, Edward Frankl talks about the Pythagoreanism, right? And the game people are talking about, like, these Eleusinian mystery schools. And the one I particularly like is the work that is being done by the Ibn Arabi Society around Persian Sufism, like mystical Islam. And what I like about that angle is that, unlike the Buddhist thing, which to me, and I'm not an expert in all these, so forgive me if I've mistaken something and stereotyped it, but it feels a bit like self-annihilation, or like dissolving to the all is the ultimate goal. For me, within my perspective, like my limited understanding of the Ibn Arabi and the Suhrawardi, is this idea of the base reality, which could be not exclusive of science and math. It's probably very much geometry and harmonics and photonics and frequency, these are all themes that come up a lot in the film, but that it is, as opposed to being a static structure, like what Peter Kingsley said of the pre-Socratics, that Aristotle and Plato sort of took out the goddess part from Parmenides and Empedocles, the idea that you would go into a dream incubation state and bring things from the depths to serve society. But the gifts in those depths came from Persephone, and she was the goddess of the underworld. And so there was a caring deity attached to it. It wasn't simply a machine. You weren't talking to a machine. You were talking to something that cared, right? And however you want to understand it, if it's Persephone or, source or God, or, but that there is this base thing that is not, it's animist. It's an animated conversation. And then in this co-creative playful universe, it's not just like we're engineers tweaking settings, but we're having a conversation. We're having a dance with reality and the way in which reality is projected. And a lot of that is through frequency and vibration. And, that's just the way it feels to me. And in my life, like I said, when I was putting together this scary version of the puzzle, in retrospect, I'm sure that I was giving off a lot of negative frequency. And it wasn't because I was trying to make life difficult. I just didn't know another way of holding it. And I felt like I needed to be responsible. And that's kind of similar to the character Ryland Grace in this film. He can't save the world. He's not confident in himself to save the world. And so he resists. He's a reluctant hero. And I think when I felt like I had to save the world, I couldn't actually do it because it was impossible. But the only thing I could do was to work within myself. And then working within myself gave me whole new lenses and ways of looking at the world that it was like, oh, wow. Well, maybe if we're not limited to 3D space-time affordances and we actually have access to higher dimensional mathematics, that isn't just a machine, but it's actually a being that's loved and that loves us, because that is the aspect of mystical Islam, like the Sufism, is that the poetry that's translated by Henri Corbin is to the beloved. Like it's a dance between beings that love one another in this flow state type of situation. And
like Dante, who begins his narrative with being lost in a dark wood, Ibn Arabi, as always, begins this treatise with a khutbah, a prologue or address, beginning with the words, "Praise be to God who was in the cloud." Thus, center stage is the divine. This is not simply some pious formula before getting down to discussing the real meat of human voyaging. On the contrary, it is an alignment to the proper order of things. Put simply, if we do not begin from the whole, from the origin of unity, we remain lost in separateness, groping in the dark wood. We have posited a starting point that is illusory. Human voyaging will only make sense within the context of reality, or from the bird's eye standpoint. After a prologue that discusses general points such as the incessant nature of voyaging, the types of voyages, the types of voyagers, the first voyage that Ibn Arabi discusses is not one made by a human being at all. It is the one made by God himself, the voyage of the One itself. The lordly voyage from the cloud to the sitting on the throne, assumed by the name All-Merciful, Ar-Rahman. So we are starting our voyaging through the book with the very reason why there's any movement in the universe at all, why we voyage at all, why the whole process of being and becoming was initiated. Those familiar with Ibn Arabi's teaching will probably at this point summarize this or relate it to the divine saying he often quotes, "I was an unknown treasure and I loved to be known, so I created the creation that I might be known." But here in the Isfar, Ibn Arabi provides a more poetic and detailed picture, one that is hugely dynamic, as its focus is on voyaging as unveiling. So firstly, a voyage from pure potentiality, symbolized by the cloud, to the appearance of mercy as the sole ruler or king of the entire all-encompassing circle of creation, as symbolized by the throne. In numerical terms, it is the voyage of the One out of the great void, a void which we cannot talk about except as an absence of number, a realm which is one of unlimited capacity of imagination before any imaging can take place. It is a voyage, in other words, from zero to oneness. It is loving mercy that caused this voyage. It is loving mercy that appears as the ultimate ruler of all that is to come into existence. In other words, Ibn Arabi is saying, the first thing that God had mercy on was himself. The second voyage is also a divine voyage, a playing out of the implications of the first one. Because if there is one, there must be two. Two worlds, creation and command. Two mirror principles, cosmos and human. Two worlds in the form of the unseen and the seen. And at the same time, this is a voyage specifically entailing unveiling, manifesting that which is hidden, displaying the differences between the high and the low. Ibn Arabi says, this is a voyage that unveils its face. It brings to light what every human being contains of blameworthy and praiseworthy character traits. And we might note that this ethical dimension is not a purely individual matter. It's intrinsic to the nature of things. It's only in the light of the divine truth, according to Ibn Arabi, that what is praiseworthy or blameworthy can really be understood. In the third voyage, that of the noble Quran, which I've already spoken about, Ibn Arabi moves on to the implications of difference, that God ceaselessly sends down inspiration as a warning and as an exposition of wisdom. This is not simply a descent of the Quran as an external book of revealed wisdom, but as the direct descent of all meaning and all wisdom as depicted in the fully human being, into the human heart. This descent is both whole, complete, as well as fragmentary, constellational, self-completing. The fourth voyage, that of vision in the signs, is expressed as a meditation on the night journey of the Prophet, in particular, the first verse of Surah 17. Glory be to him who carried his servant by night from the inviolable place of prostration to the furthest place of prostration, that we might show him of our signs. This voyage centers on vision of divine signs, but then Ibn Arabi says it confirms the Prophet in his election to the station of love, because he took him as an intimate friend and beloved. And it's clear from Ibn Arabi's discussion that what God loves in the Prophet is himself. For what gives rise to the elevation of the true human being is the full realization of being servant, not as something, but as a nothing. Love, he says, demands jealousy, so there remains no trace of the servant. And yet, the servant, he says, is powerful, and there's no restriction upon him because of his divine identity. So this is a voyage of two lover-beloveds in two places of vision. These first four voyages express the total alignment of the divine order from its highest degree to its lowest, as found within the truly human being. They express an eternal template of all voyaging. On the divine side, a movement of love and of mercy to his own possibilities. On the human side, a movement of servanthood, not as someone with a choice whether to obey or disobey, but simply the complete prostration of the heart to the Lord, without there being any command to do so, and without this signifying anything but the intrinsic act of being human. And in one sense, one could say, this is all that has ever happened. God's outpouring of himself into his beloved so that the divine mystery can be known. In many ways, these four voyages express and amplify the same principle that Ibn Arabi puts so succinctly in the opening paragraph of the beginning of his Fusus. The real wanted to see the essences of his most beautiful names, whose number cannot be counted. Or if you like, you may say, he wanted to see his own essence, in an all-inclusive created being that encompasses the whole order, because it is qualified by existence, and in which he could manifest his mystery to himself. So in conclusion, what is it that makes this book so compelling? And why indeed should one study voyages made by prophets apparently so long ago? And what does this book have to say to us in the second decade of the 21st century? For some people, the ultimate criterion of a human being is to beautify. That's to say, to make the world a better place than we found it. To contribute, so that the world is better off for us having been in it. But for Ibn Arabi, there is really a much greater vision than ideas of our self-worth. He's interested in the reality of our self-worth. He says about this book, all these voyages are only bridges and pontoons that are placed for us to cross over to our own essences and the states that are specific to us. He then goes on in the most explicit fashion in the Isfar to describe what he really means in this book. This is at the end of the 9th voyage, that of approach and no turning back. What I have recounted to you is to remind you of what is within you. And what I've called your attention to is so that you will know that you are everything, in everything, and part of everything. Thank you very much.
Grace is dancing with a mop because he's alone. He's the only one left on the spaceship who survived the trip. And and then mop. It reminds me a lot of my Nicotiana. The deer have not hit the Nicotiana sylvestris yet. So there are these very long, dangly, white, perfumed flowers that hang down. And the thing about Nicotiana sylvestris is it perfumes at night, which is in the darkness. And Peter Kingsley said, he had a visitation as a relatively young guy by Parmenides, and it was characterized by fragrance. And so when I'm out surrounded by these grand, the Nicotiana sylvestris is as tall as me at this point. It will get taller, I'm sure, by the end of the summer. And these pendulous white flowers that look like mops, and they're so fragrant. It's like connecting with the goddess, kind of, and through this fragrance and through this night sort of liminal, dusky way of being.
Well, it started for me for the first 30 years. It was really a very private affair. It was just me and Parmenides, Empedocles, two ancient Greeks who hardly anybody even knows about. They were alive for me, but they died 2,500 years ago. They became my teachers, and they would take me through life events. They would put me through all sorts of experiences, most of which it would take me years and years to start to understand. But it was, to begin with, it was always something personal, because I couldn't even start to describe the impact, the significance of this people to anybody else. I tried. I went to Cambridge University. Afterwards, I got a special scholarship to go to Cambridge, and I thought, this is my perfect chance to speak to the people who are experts in ancient philosophy, who are historians of philosophy, who translate these ancient Greeks. And they didn't want to know, because basically what I discovered was these people from 2,500 years ago, who only a few specialists know about and consider rational, intellectual thinkers, that they were very, very great spiritual beings with a quality of power of presence that's actually still alive. And how can you describe that to most people? You can't. And so it was really just, for 30 years, it was an internal process of them working on me. I left my studies altogether. I left academia. I'd work in hardware stores. I'd work in restaurants, mopping up, doing all sorts of things. And I think one of the very important things for me was, I believe it was in the late 1980s. And again, it was an accident. Maybe you know the bookstore in North London, Compendium. And I went in there one day, and literally a book just fell on me. And I picked it up, and it was open at this page where there was a 16th century Persian Sufi describing how his Sufi lineage went back not to Muhammad, but to Empedocles and the ancient Greeks, who, he's very careful to say, were not philosophers or rationalists, but they were great spiritual beings. They were the greatest spiritual beings of their time. Empedocles and Parmenides, I came to understand much more clearly over the years. These were not just mystics who happened to live 2,500 years ago at the time when Western civilization was coming into being in the shape, the form that we know it now. These were the people who actually created Western civilization. They very consciously seeded, they planted the germs of what was to become Western culture. It was actually, literally, it was brought into existence from another world and planted in this world. And they describe very clearly how they did it. They brought a divine teaching, divine laws, divine principles from another world, an unseen world, into this physical world. And they planted those teachings. And out of those seeds that they planted, a Western civilization came into being. The only people I found outside myself who talked about this were Persian Sufis, were people from the East, from another culture. It's actually people in the East, it's people in Iran who understand the origins of Western civilization. This natural, very, very, very deep process that we're all a part of, it's not really understood anymore. We don't know that there's a sacred tradition at the origins of Western civilization. We don't know that there's a sacred tradition that gave rise to logic and biology and chemistry, and we just don't understand. There's so much that's been lost. It's unbelievable. When we discover in the West our own sacred tradition, this sacred tradition I've been talking about that lies at the origins of Western civilization, of Western science, of Western thinking, once we have a firm grounding, footing in our own Western sacred tradition, then we can relate to other sacred traditions. I mean, one of the foundation stones of Western civilization, Western science, is the discipline of logic. There's nothing really more, if you like, materialistic that you can get than the rules of logic, the hard rules of logic that I remember at college being forced to learn all these things they put up on a blackboard, these terrible symbols and squiggles. It's like it can be so harsh, this mental, almost this butchery of the mind. You just have to try and discipline yourself to learn the rules of logic. And that is how we try and live in so many respects, logically, not intuitively, but logically. And what we don't know is that this man, Parmenides, 2,500 years ago, living in southern Italy, he brought the laws of logic into existence. And there's no question about that. Everybody admits that he was the father of Western logic. But what they don't see anymore is that he brought these rules of logic from another world. He was given all this teaching about logic by a goddess. And what is logic? Now we look at the laws of logic, the principles. Parmenides didn't really care about, because he used logic. This was the first ever use of logic in the West. He used logic to prove oneness. And it was like he was saying, here is logic, this divine gift, and this is a gift that's meant to take us to a realization, to an understanding of deep, deep oneness. Oneness with everything. He used logic to demonstrate that oneness includes everything. It includes the senses. And this is another very, very strange aspect of this tradition, that these people had teachings about the senses. They were very, very grounded. They didn't say just leave the world of the senses behind, try and find oneness in another world, try and find reality somewhere else. They said, no, you have to find reality, ultimate reality, here where you are, in this apparent body, surrounded by these apparent colors and movements and shapes and forms and sounds and noises. And they gave the techniques, they gave the methods for using our senses to find oneness all around us. And Empedocles gave very, very specific directions for how to start to become conscious through your senses, how to look and be aware that you're looking, and how to do this with all of the senses at the same time. And this last stage about how to do it with all the senses at the same time, this is very, very powerful. It's very, very esoteric. It is an extraordinarily elegant way of realizing God, not by leaving the senses behind, but by consciously using all of your senses at the same time. It's difficult enough even to do one of those consciously, but if you do them all consciously, you become aware of this infinite blackness between them. There is a void that connects the seeing to the hearing, to the tasting, to the touching. And that eternity is totally unchanging, but that eternity is also what gives rise to the physical world.
So I guess mostly, I have way more to say about the movie, and I'll probably do maybe a more formal deconstruction, but I wanted to present this idea about the blocks and the technology, because ultimately, okay, so this is one thing I'm going to say. There was a nice podcast, and you can see a clip of it on my channel, where the presenter was talking with the man who wrote the novel. And of course, movies, even a 2.5-hour long movie, can't include everything. And I guess Andy Weir is the author's name. And so Andy Weir had written 16 pages about the biology of the rock character that's Rocky. And he came from a particular planet that is a real planet. And so he does hard science fiction, and he wanted to be able to make a character that comes from a world. I have a friend who says you have to make the world before you can make the character, because the character is a logical extension of the world. And so he writes 16 pages of what this being would be. And some of the key elements. So it's a rock. It has 5 legs. So it has an up and a down orientation, but it doesn't have a front and a back, because the 5 is an odd number. So it's non-linear, shall we say. So it has a non-linear aspect. It speaks in chords, chords, so musical chords, and including some of the chords right on top of each other, so you could have like 2 conversations with different entities at once. And so they're layered. And so the idea of the chord is like it's an organ, or maybe even like a whale sound. And I have a friend, I talk about my friend Star, and she has this really amazing 3-chambered flute called an inato that she found through one of her connections at the Vesta House, and they're handmade, and they are chords, and the 3 lobes, you can actually put it on someone's head and play it into the frequency. And so if you imagine harmonics and geometry as being a base of like calling in different sounds to people. So he speaks in chords and tubes through these tubes. And his circulation system, because the atmosphere is so hot, is mercury as opposed to water, because water would boil away. So mercury is very alchemical. There are a lot of alchemical themes in the movie. And then within the carapace is both animal and plant cells. So it's like its own little biosphere.
I would love to know about your process there.
Well, I started off with the real exoplanet, 40 Eridani AB, which is about 8 times Earth's mass. It orbits the star about every 46 days. So it's very close. It's closer to its star than Mercury is to ours. So I said, like, okay, if that's going to be the planet, then what do I have to do to make this a place where life could exist? And within the context of the story, there was a panspermia event. So it has to be like water-based life. And so I'm like, well, to have liquid water that's really, really hot, you have to have a really high atmospheric pressure because, the higher the pressure, the higher the boiling point of water. So, okay, they're going to have a big, thick atmosphere. But if you're going to have a big, thick atmosphere and you're right next to a star, the star is basically going to sandblast your atmosphere away. The only way to retain it is to have a really strong magnetic field. So now I know, okay, they have a really thick atmosphere and the planet spins really quickly. Their day is not very long. If they have an atmosphere that thick, I figure maybe light doesn't make it all the way to the surface, so there's no benefit to evolving vision because there's no light on the surface. And I figured their biosphere is almost like an ocean. It's like there's life forms that absorb light and live that way up at the upper levels of the atmosphere, and then things below that eat those, and things below that. I decided the atmosphere is made almost entirely of ammonia. That means there's not free oxygen in the atmosphere, which we rely on, right? So I figured the inside of their body is like a biosphere. They have plant-like cells and animal-like cells that keep in balance. They go back and forth, and all they need to do is add energy to the system via food. An iridian is almost like it's only got about 1 kilogram of actual biological matter. The rest of it is all just stuff that those little worker cells built. So an iridian is kind of like a beehive that can move. It's got the vast majority of it is inorganic matter. It's just a container for this biosphere that exists on the inside.
And the mind of Rocky is a crystal. Right? So Rocky is a biocomputer. He's a friendly biocomputer. But that is also an animist rock being, right? And so I feel like there, in some ways, the movie is about the sort of the alchemical transformation of Ryland Grace, the reluctant, sort of downtrodden physicist whose theory was stomped down, who is, has a really good time teaching kids, in middle school kids, science, ends up being this bigger hero who believes in himself because of his connection, the teaming with this rocky alien creature. And so it's an alchemical process within the confines, mostly of the spaceship, which is Mary. And Mary is the archetypal goddess of compassionate witness. And so there are many aspects of connected to Gurdjieff and the spiritual awakening and being asleep and awakening to your potential. And my sense is Rocky is his philosopher's stone to get to that place where collectively the two of them can resolve the problem of the sun that's dimming, because they both believed in one another, right? And so in that, the relationality of love, that sort of like as Maturana said, love is the core of the universe, right? Things come from love. That this interdimensional, interspecies teaming, caring, depth of care across species is what sort of saved all of the worlds, right? That undimmed the stars. And it did it not by killing off the thing that was dimming the stars, but just simply by balancing it out. And so when Ryan Gosling says, I wanted a movie that says maybe we don't have to fear it, we just have to figure it out, right? Even if there's a thing that's feels like a threat, we don't have to fear it. We just have to figure it out. And then in knowing and recognizing its beingness, it becomes not scary. It becomes not the threat. It's just another thing to dance with.
One thing I wanted to dive a little bit deeper in is the physics of love, that all the physical forces, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, are aspects of universal love, and so potentially is space-time. Can you expand on that? And then also bosons kind of play a role in that?
Bosons, the best things, yes. What I mean by that is really simple, which is that if everything comes from one foundational force, it seems to me that foundational idea, substance, is universal love. Because if we're defining universal love as that which connects, so it's the idea that connection is the underlying entity. Obviously, I'm struggling with a noun. It doesn't feel like a noun, it feels like a verb, which is why I'm struggling with it. Connecting is what creates the rest of the universe. The act of connecting. So that's universal love, that which connects. So you don't get space-time without, you can't even speak about what space-time is without relationship, connection. You can't speak about the informational substrate and how it relates to space-time without connection. You can't speak about matter and energy without these relationships. And by connection, I don't mean always a pull, like an attractive force. Like there's also repulsive force. That's connection of just different signs. And so when you think of these forces, that's just a description of a relationship that governs different things. Relationship, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, all of it is relationship. And relationship is this description of connection. So each of those is essentially an equation of connection that describes the relationship. So the reason I sort of bring up bosons versus fermions are your more let's act like billiard balls kind of particles, in that you have a fermion here. So like you have, let's say, an electron here that cannot be in the same place as this electron. If this electron is in this place and has this particular quantum configuration, there's no way that this other electron can be in the same place with the same quantum configuration. Okay, that sort of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Bosons, however, are like, by the way, here's a boson, let's say like as a photon, which are bosons, also Higgs boson is a boson, but let's say it's a photon. This photon can be in the same place as another photon that has exactly the same properties. And in fact, it's also, by the way, if this photon is here in 2025 and this photon is here in 1932, and they have the same properties, they have the same momentum, they've got the same polarization, they've got the same frequency, those are the same photon. So photons are cool because they're like pretty time independent.
Yeah.
Those are the same photon.
Yeah.
And so bosons rock in my worldview, and they're my sort of vote. If you have to think about I have no idea what the physics of love will end up being, but this is sort of my first stab attempt. If you have to think about the physics of love, and I felt like when I wrote that chapter, I had to do that because that was the chapter title. It feels like bosons are like the first guess for something that binds together this informational substrate dimension with this space-time matter-energy thing. Clearly, they're not following these space-time rules and these matter and energy rules that we're used to. Like those are very unusual rules. Those feel more like informational rules. What matters is the description of the photon rather than the location in space-time. That feels very informational.
Just like my deer addicts, my overnight deer partiers or whatever in my garden, right? You don't have to be angry or fearful of them. Like, and I'm telling this myself because, I'm just still really a little bit cheesed about the orange gladiolus, but I have to admire their ingenuity. They must have very delicate nibblers to come and like nibble, not just the whole stalk, but just the little flowers as they open up. And I feel like there's a deep aspect of the geometry in the flowers. Like I'm living, and I was telling someone today, I always thought it was interesting that when I was doing this research, I kept bumping up against mining people, right? Tom Van Ark was in mining, Colorado School of Mines, and Pavel Laksha was in mining. And there's not all the time, but there was a disproportionate number of miners. And I'm realizing that if this beingness of the earth is a giant harmonic wave, of which we're so tiny that we can't even see that it's a wave because it's so vast. The thing that could hold the vastness of that time scale would be the geology. And that links to the T-Rain game and Neal Stephenson's Remedyan Fall. That the geology holds the time, and that by getting down in the dirt, you can't see all my cuts on my hands because I'm not good at using gardening gloves, and the soil does really wreck my skin on my hands. But it's like nano, right? It's natural nano, that if the power of the rocks to hold this scale of time, the little bits of soil that come off the sandstone, because I'm sitting on a giant ocean floor that got tilted up in the Ouachita orogeny when South America hit Laurentia, I guess, which is North America, and made giant mountains that are now just like very gentle little hills that go from here down to West Texas. But there's giant ancient time under my fingernails, and there's just like a little bit every day, and we're in resonance. If it's a harmonic, like I'm getting my own little daily dose, not just of like materialist like probiotics and blah blah blah, but like literally a frequency. And so yeah, maybe I had to get kicked out of my old life from this scary story so I could look under the kitchen table and go, oh, actually, it's this really cool co-creative universe with the divine beloved who happens to be geometry. And like, yeah, that's hard because I've always sucked at math. But like, oh, this is a geometry. If my friend Richard and some of us can come up with a way of doing a language that like bridges the abstract math for not people who don't perceive themselves as mathematicians, but maybe we're just gardeners and artists and dancers, and we're doing that version. I would love that. And like, how fun to be like, is this my equivalent of getting to go to space and like making the alien best friend and saving the world? Like, maybe that's a good story to tell. Like, no guarantees, but it's not an impossible story. It's a possible story, especially if you're working with a tetrahedron or something like that. Not tetrahedron, tesseract. If you got a tesseract, I'm sure there's some version of that story in the tesseract that I could tell. So anyway, I guess Project Hail Mary, it was an Amazon production, and it's funny because at the beginning it's MGM Amazon, but the logo with I always thought it was kind of like a quirky smile, but it's like this swoosh, and it felt like in the film, because I saw it in the theater. I saw it twice in the theater, and I don't see movies. I haven't seen a movie since that Wicked one, which was like a year and a half ago. But the swoosh is like definitely feels very category theoretic. And actually, at the end of this, I might put in my my friend Laura. So this is the other thing that I always forget to say the thing. So if Rocky is a biocomputer and his mind is a quartz crystal, and I'm sitting on the second largest quartz crystal deposit in the world, that's very appreciated by Alice Walton and the Avant Mining folks, and that it's a heartbeat, like it's an oscillator of 3D space-time. And Rocky has a crystal mind and Mercury blood, which is interdimensional communication, and this Gaia hypothesis, Carpus body holding animals and plants, and like eukaryotic aspects, and how we play in this space. Like the Philosopher's Stone could be the idea that grace, again, through grace, is able to reconnect with technology as nature. Like the minds of these technology systems are also nature. Now, do we need to find a way to I am convinced that this stuff is like training wheels, like these square things that we're looking at, or these phones or these wearables. They're just training wheels for when we remember how we used to do it, like when we had ancient ancestors in the caves and with drums. Like we won't need to be digging up all of the stuff and tearing down all of the trees and forests. And I'm not saying that's not happening. And it is, but I think there's this ecological reservoir computing that's going to be coming online next. And that plus thorium reactors are probably going to be the next green energy thing. But do we have to be afraid of it? Maybe not. Like maybe it's the technology is actually natural, and maybe it's nature wanting to have a conversation, and it's technology coming through a cute puppet rock character that reintroduces us that yes, like the technology can be nature, right? The technology can be nature. And does it still haunt me off about like impact bonds and forest bathing? Kind of. I'm still human, but I'm also like, I can see that the top of that puzzle piece and I can go, okay, Jennifer Braith there. Like, I'll look at the bottom because maybe the bottom is the more fun place to focus my attention. Not to say that your other scary story isn't a thing. It could totally be a thing, but I don't want to live there. I don't want to live in that particular version. I want to co-create my own version. And, which again is not to be in denial of the other options. And people can choose to live in different options. Like I said, Donald Hoffman says, agency is choosing your observer window. And, I did ask a comment on one of the talks. I'm like, well, the free energy principle tries to minimize surprise. So that the idea is like you try to minimize the surprise you have. But I'm like, if you can do the curious observer version, you should be able to pop in and out of a lot of observer windows and not be surprised, because you know that there are different windows that hold different perspectives. And so even though if you were inhabiting one particular type of observer that had a certain kind of ego and you looked out somebody else's observer window, it would look jarring. But if you can detach enough from your own sense of identity to look out of different windows without being triggered all the time, it gives you a much broader perspective, I think. And there's actually, maybe later on I'll have some time to make some clips, but Michael Levin has this discussion on Platonic space where it's the 5th one. So if you look like Platonic space discussion 5, it's recent on his, if you look at this date, this is like early June, like June 2nd, 2026. So go back to June in 2026, you'll see a Platonic space 5, but they're literally talking about interdimensional economics, but they don't really realize that it's another dimension. They think it's something else. Like it's in there. And there's a whole big section about dance that Carl Friston talks a lot about flow state and dance and dissolving boundaries and sort of shared mind, which there's a scene where Grace, because he's all alone, is dancing with that mop, which reminds me of my Nicotiana. But it's like the idea of the dance is that connection of the merging of the self with another self, not by force, but simply by focused attention. And in that space, you have new affordances. And I think going back to like the Babel 17 teaming, that's important.
So fun to work with because they're willing to explore any direction that the scene is taking us. I remember there was a scene where I had been working for like maybe 100 days or something alone or something, and I just was kind of needing company. So I said, I want to make a friend out of a mop, and I want to do the scenes today with this mop friend. And they were like on it, and they were like both got materials, and they made this mop for me that they called Moppy Ringwall, and I got to spend the day. We danced, and it was like not many filmmakers are going to stop everything and make a mop friend for you. It's just they're just great dance partners in that way.
Yeah, so those are all interesting things, but I'm gonna put in the clip from this song about geometry, because one of the things that we're trying to imagine is a fun place to like play with ideas that's open source and interesting and interdisciplinary and like playing around with some ideas for titles. But like I think that this song that Laura sent me, it's called Let's Make Geometry or something like that, or maybe she said the title like when she sent it, Let's Make Geometry, but geometry might be the title. But it's great because I think actually there could be a world where the beloved is geometry plus harmonics plus light, and we are of that. We are in conversation with that. And so can we use the Philosopher's Stone of our beingness to get back to that place that we can be more intentional with our conversations and have conversations that are collective in nature, that benefit us collectively and make something beautiful. Because I don't want to be fearful of the future. I want to find some stuff out and then find things out and use them in ways that, again, are attuned to our own personal values in such a way that we don't bump into and hurt other people. And I think it's totally possible. I do think it's totally possible. So remember the puzzle blocks. If you're putting something together and it feels a certain way, accidentally knock off one off the edge of the table and look at it up from underneath on the glass table, and you'll see there's something else that you built and you didn't even know you built it. And it'll be exciting to see what that is. And then imagine it with tesseracts or maybe an lattice, and there's like the possibilities are endless. So Oh, and also, if you watch the clip with, maybe I'll drop that in, Ryan Gosling, he talks a lot about costumes. And there's a huge amount of phenomenology because he's like in a coma and then he's waking up and he's trying to figure out who he is through artifacts. And so I like this space that we're imagining is like, how do we play with artifacts with meaning and symbolism and layers of information and moving things around individually and collectively? Like, I think it has such potential. So, all right. Bye, everybody.
And all his like graphic tees, his sweaters. What was your favorite of his looks? And how did they like clue you into who he was?
There were so many. It was like a Matushka doll of looks. You know, there was the space caveman in the placenta onesie. There was this like ramen eating phase where he was wearing like a Wham hat and like he had a mustache for a while. Val Kilmer was a big inspo for from Real Genius. We thought it would be fun if we gave him these shirts because he didn't know who he was. So he was like trying to glean a sense of his own personality, but just always being thrown curveballs like, I love cats, I guess. The fox thing was like a little Easter egg for my kids. We had found one that was a wolf. I think those sweaters are harder to make than I thought. And so it was like, it ended up being more of a thing than I realized. But anyway, we made them into foxes instead. So it's just a little Easter egg for my kids. This is, my dream is to make Halloween costumes. It's really all I do this for. I never felt like I made it until I saw a guy dressed like the driver on Halloween. And I was like, okay, here we go. This is like a whole party box of costumes. My hope is that there's so many here.
The sun, the inner light, the focus on lenses, the focus on mirrors, on communication and calling in regards to the beloved or the other, the connectivity, which is the category theory, right? The umbrella with all of the different colors and the idea of the photonics and the light over your crown chakra, your umbrella, and this idea of a frame, like what is your frame? What is your observer window? And, the magnifying glass, like what are you paying attention to, focused attention, and what is outside the range of your attention? And the idea of harmonics, right? You've even got the pink dolphin phone, which is super interesting. And then alternate ways of using technology and as a flute or, and again, the trumpeting and the dance, right? Like using our bodies to communicate. These are all things, and being in connection with one another, right? And then you've got the gliding and the bird flying, which is the geometry itself, and the connection and finding ourselves and wanting a different frame. And then we've got cats, right? the category cat and some more frames. And the airplanes going up, right? And the fingers shooting out the photonic lines, which would be like the category theory connectors for relationality, like how we relate to one another. And then building geometry. So then we've got the Buckminster Fuller Dome, which I had one in 3rd grade, Mrs. Neview's class. And when you got to read, if you got done with your classwork, you could go in the dome and read. And so look, that's exactly what they're doing. They're reading under their photonic hat with they're other little creatures, they're friends, right? But it's participatory. So they're using the technology, but they're in control of it. And then you go back Garfield and chess and more photonic lines and dream states. Waking up, the spiritual journey. And some more walking, some more frames. The rain, right? The water memory, that seems pretty fun. And again, how do we make geometry? How do we build our own structures that we live inside with other people, which are sort of like Holons, right? In our Markov blankets, that we build the reality by how we communicate with each other, who we choose to talk to, and the possibility of being in contact with higher dimensional intelligences. And you've got more water, some destruction in the background, right? Taking down the old ways of doing it and getting a new frame. And just perceiving from this high level, right? The bird's eye view, and communicating with the field, with our frequency devices, which are very fun and silly and light-based. And participatory with the body, that our body is also part of the technology. And the heart being the central interface, and that's a big part of Sufi mysticism. And then you've got the Whole Earth Catalog, or the last Whole Earth Catalog, which is Stuart Brand, that has connections to the solar house, again, the sun, Long Now Foundation, and and by that way, Kevin Kelly, Teen Kelly, and the Vesta House Ladies, and all the frequencies, and how we participate in shaping our reality with how we work with the frequencies, and how it can be fun. They make it look pretty fun. So I just want to thank my friend Laura for sharing this with me, because it really kind of encapsulates so much. This is the way in which like art can hold so many elements that you couldn't really articulate individually. Beautiful. Playcat Geo.
Algebra, physics, chemistry,
Yeah.
trigonometry.
Music and spirituality doesn't have to be separate from math and science. Art and ritual, it all goes together.